what I think I'll try and do is to zoom out a little bit, to try and look at this problem in a structural way. What exactly is the situation that we are in now? Because the way the whole debate is being presented to the public, you saw the interview with Chidambaram on the cover of Tehelka. He says, stop the violence for 72 hours and I will sort out the war, which suggests that someone else is doing the violence and he's asking for peace. And the whole of Operation Green Hunt is presented to us as though the government is trying to bring peace to the tribal areas. It has to make war in order to bring peace, in order to end the violence. But actually, the truth is that these corporate companies and this corporate-backed government desperately needs this war. It needs this war in order to get people off their lands, and that's why this war is being fought. Let's not even for 1 minute try and fool ourselves to think that the government is trying to make peace. The policy is a policy of war. So I'm going to just read from something that I've written, which first puts this in a perspective, and then I'll speak and then I'll read a little bit more. It's from a lecture that I recently did, and it's called, Can We Leave the Bauxite in the Mountain? It's part of many things I've been writing over the years. But while we're still arguing about whether there's life after death, can we add another question to the cart? Is there life after democracy? And what sort of life will it be? By democracy, I don't mean democracy as an ideal or an aspiration. I mean the working model, Western liberal democracy and its variants, such as they are. So, is there life after democracy? Because the real question is, what have we done to democracy? What have we turned it into? What happens once democracy has been used up, when it has been hollowed out and emptied of meaning? What happens when each of its institutions has turned into something dangerous? What happens now that democracy and the free market have fused into a single predatory organism with a thin, constricted imagination that revolves almost entirely around the idea of maximizing profit? Is it possible to reverse this process? Can something that has mutated go back to being what it used to be? What we need today for the sake of the survival of this planet is long-term vision. Can governments whose very survival depends on immediate, extractive, short-term gain provide this? Could it be that democracy, the sacred answer to our short-term hopes and prayers, the protector of our individual freedoms and nurturer of our avaricious dreams, will turn out to be the end game for the human race? Could it be that democracy is such a hit with modern humans precisely because it mirrors our greatest folly, our nearsightedness, our inability to live entirely in the present like most animals do, combined with our inability to see very far into the future, makes us strange in-between creatures, neither beast nor prophet. Our amazing intelligence seems to have outstripped our instinct for survival. We plunder the earth, hoping that accumulating material surplus will make up for the profound, unfathomable thing that we have lost. There was a time not so long ago, even up to the 70s, when democracy in former colonies actually threatened imperial power. So you saw that the Soviet Union, of course, had done away with it. But the United States was toppling democracy after democracy all over Latin America, in Iran, and so on. So why is it that democracy, which was at one time a threat to imperialism, today wars are being waged in order to put in democracies? Why is it that democracy has stopped being a threat? Because capitalism and the free market has learned how to operate democracies. It's learned how to hollow out every single one of those institutions and make it work for itself. So when I was in school once long ago, I raided the vegetable garden of my Malayalam school teacher, and I stole all the carrots and I planted the tops back. And I watched him for days watering those plants and wondering why they were dying. And I think this is what has happened to our democracy. Each of these institutions, the court, the media, the parliament, the elections, all of these have been hollowed out and made into rituals that have been put into place. And we continue to water these institutions, to believe in them, while they wilt and die. India is an oligarchy, it's not a democracy. So when I criticize democracy, I've had many people, in our intellectuals, not only are they dishonest, but naturally they think like the state. Naturally, they're also sort of slightly preachy school teachers, so they tell you, no, but democracy works, how can you criticize it? There's been so much development all over the place. I say, yes, democracy works in Greater Kailash, but it doesn't work in Dantewada, So if you have a room in which there are 10 people, and of those 10 people, 2 are billionaires, 2 are reasonably okay, and the rest of the 6 are starving, what are you going to say? 60-40, everything's okay? Depending on where you place your feet defines your politics. We do not place, at least I don't think any of us in this room want to place our feet on the Forbes list of billionaires and say we have so many billionaires. We want to place our feet where the majority of the population of the world's malnutrition people, children live in this country. We want to place our feet in the place where 200,000 farmers have committed suicide, where not a single river runs to the sea, where the groundwater levels are dipping so fast, where huge godowns full of food are rotting, while the poor are starving to death. So that defines your politics. Because always in India, you'll find when there's a massacre in Dantewada, of course there's an IPL match going on in Chennai or in Bangalore. You can surely watch that. Or you can surely watch the Miss Universe or whatever it is. There's always something else to do. There's always something hopeful to do. And one thing I want to say is, in this whole debate, as a writer, I think the really big issue is the theft of language. And I don't mean the language as in Gondi or Bengali or Hindi. I'm talking about it at a much more profound level, where they have stolen words like freedom and development and progress. They've stolen these words and deployed them like weapons against us to mean the opposite of what they were meant to mean. So the theft of language is the keystone of this project. So they've stolen the language with which to critique them. So you critique them, you're negative. You try to save a river, you're against development. You try to talk about the suffering of people, you're against the market. The market has come to mean the stock exchange, not the bazaar where you go to buy vegetables. Everything has been taken and turned around. I was at a water conference once. Actually, I'd gone there only with the intention of wrecking it, because I knew that the Indian government had sent representatives to defend big dams there. And I was on a panel of supposedly writers, but I was the only real writer. The rest were writers of privatization policies for water. And everybody was supposed to introduce themselves and say why they write about water. And there was an American man sitting next to me, and I forgot what his name was anyway, whatever. He said, my name is Robert something, and I write about water because I'm paid to. And I just want to say that God gave us the rivers, but he didn't put in the delivery systems. And for this, we need private enterprise. So I was the next person, and I said, you know, I'm Arundhati Roy, and I write about water because I would be paid a great deal not to. And, you know, that I said it's been a long time since I've been in a room where writers spend their life trying to close the gap between thought and language, trying to be able to express exactly what you're thinking. And here I am in a room full of people who are involved in exactly the opposite enterprise, who have developed a language to mask intent, who have developed a way of writing things that sound very democratic, which mean exactly the opposite. So this theft of language is something that we ought to really look at very seriously. Anyway, coming back to the talk about democracy, I think if we look at our own democracy, it's as good a place as any to start understanding what all of this means. Almost from the moment it became a sovereign nation, India turned into a colonial power, almost overnight, annexing territory and waging war. It has never hesitated to use military interventions to address political problems. Kashmir, Hyderabad, Goa, Nagaland, Manipur, Telangana, Assam, Punjab, the Naxalite uprising in West Bengal, Bihar, and Andhra Pradesh. Now, I was actually sitting in the forest in Dantewada thinking about this accusation that's always made against the Maoists, you know, that's central to their belief is the idea of protracted war. It is true that it's central to their belief, but nobody could have waged more protracted war than the Indian state. And when I started looking at this list of military interventions, something very terrifying emerged. If you think about this list that I've just read out, who are the people that the Indian state has waged war against? Either Muslims, or tribals, or communists, or the poor. I mean, look at the list. Goa, Hyderabad, Kashmir, Manipur, Telangana, Assam, Punjab, and the Naxalites who are normally tribal people or Dalits. So, how can you avoid looking at this as an upper caste Hindu state, always ready to wage war against the other? Whenever there have been problems like in Gujarat or in Bombay after the breaking of the Babri Masjid, immediately the security forces and the police are on the side of the perpetrators. It's a very, very frightening thought. So in this whole sort of spectrum of war that the Indian state has been engaged in, we have had tens of thousands of people killed, 70,000 in Kashmir alone, no account of how many people have been killed in Manipur, Nagaland, and so on, no account of how many people were killed here in West Bengal in the early 70s, no account of how many people were killed in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana, and so on. There's no count. We are a nation of statisticians, but there are certain statistics that we don't like to know. how many people have been displaced by big dams, how many people have been killed with complete impunity by this so-called democracy. So like the other great democracies in the world, Indian democracy too is laid on a foundation of blood and military intervention. Some years ago, I gave the first Hrant Dink Memorial Lecture in Istanbul. Hrant Dink was an Armenian journalist who was killed for doing something that you're not supposed to do in Turkey, which is to talk about the Armenian genocide in which 1 million people were killed in 1915. My lecture was about the history of genocide and the old and almost organic relationship between progress and genocide. And I was very taken by the fact that the political party that committed that genocide in Turkey in 1915 was called the Committee for Union and Progress. And as we know, the words for union and progress today, in today's lexicon, are nationalism and development. And I began to think of the Congress Party and the BJP, and basically all their smaller cousins, the mainstream political parties, including the CPM, as our own Committee for Union and Progress. And so what has this Committee for Union and Progress been up to in this, when you look at a nation that's supposed to be perched on the brink of leaping into the world, into the club of superpowers, perched and on the upward curve of progress, you have to ask, is it also perched on the verge of committing genocide? It's a question we have to ask ourselves. So, to look at it, I think let's just put the milestone down in 1989, when capitalism won its jihad against Soviet communism in the bleak mountains of Afghanistan. As soon as that happened, and we had a unipolar world, the government of India, which was a non-aligned country, did a quick somersault and aligned itself with the US and Israel. Suddenly, from being non-aligned, it became completely aligned. And once a friend of the Palestinians, now it's a natural ally of Israel, from which it's buying its bombers and thermal imaging and laser ranger finders to use against its own poor people. But in 1989, two things happened. Two locks were opened. One was the lock of an old 17th century mosque called the Babri Masjid. And the other was the lock of the Indian markets that had been protected until then. And the opening of these two locks unleashed two kinds of fundamentalism, two kinds of totalitarianism: economic totalitarianism and Hindu fundamentalism. And these two have together journeyed as the Committee of Union and Progress. Until today, they have married each other and even kiss in public when Ratan Tata and Ambani were greeted by Narendra Modi, and they said that they would like him to be a prime ministerial candidate. So here we have a situation in which, though again and again we are told the Maoists want to overthrow the Indian state, I want to say that the Indian state was overthrown long ago by the Hindutva project and by the corporate project. It has been already overthrown. So, of course, one of the first things that happened in 1989 to 90 was, the uprising in Kashmir, the armed uprising, which was crushed by the Indian government, in which many, many thousands of people died. But the BJP, which is in charge of the Union project, and the Congress and its allies in charge of the Progress project. So let's just look at them two separately. The BJP's union project has largely been entrusted to the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the Bajrang Dal, and so on. You know that the RSS was founded in 1925, and Hedgewar, a fan of Benito Mussolini's, of course, began to model it openly along the lines of Italian fascism. And I just want to read one or two things about, I mean, this is connected to Operation Green Hunt, you know. When they say that the Maoists call the parliament a pigsty, so does the RSS. But the RSS has prime ministerial candidates waiting in the wings, and that's all right. Here are some of the things that are said in Golwalkar's book. Ever since that evil day when Muslims first landed in Hindustan, right up to the present moment, the Hindu nation has been gallantly fighting to take on these despoilers. The race spirit has been awakened. In Hindustan, the land of Hindus, should live the Hindu nation, and all others are traitors or enemies to the national cause and should live as second-class citizens. And of course, there's a whole lot of literature about how much they admired Hitler. And it's interesting that Hindutva, who admires Hitler, and the Zionists are now the closest of friends. Strange, strange alliances. But I don't have to tell all of you what the RSS and the Hindutva project has done. I mean, you all know about what happened in Gujarat, and you all know how democracy was used in Gujarat. You know, when you commit a genocide, and then to keep the lid on it, the people have to apply through proper channels, you know. So in Gujarat cities, of course, the Muslims live in ghettos, which are called Pakistan. People keep talking about the fact that, you know, in this war against Maoists, the Adivasis are the ones who are getting killed on both sides, or the poor are getting killed on both sides. This is the case, this was the case in Gujarat too, and if you go there now, the Muslims live in ghettos, real proper ghettos. Even the middle-class Muslims cannot live outside these ghettos. And just around the ghettos live the Dalits. That's the border. And that's where the clashes happen. And of course, that ghetto, Muslim ghetto, is called Pakistan. If you go to Dantewada, the Indravati is the border. Across it is Pakistan, the Maoist territory. So slowly, India is turning into Pakistan. Very interesting. So you had the killers of the Gujarat genocide on TV in that telecast sting operation, openly boasting about how they killed, how they raped, how they hacked Ehsan Jafri to death. And what was the overall consensus about that? There was suspicion about the timing. They said maybe Modi had organized the sting himself in order to win the elections again. And he did win the elections again. All the people who are baying for our blood, when we are talking about what we are talking about is happening in these tribal areas, those same people invite Narendra Modi to the studio. They call him the development chief minister. An editor of a national daily said, he may be a mass murderer, but he's our mass murderer. You know, so this is our attitude, the establishment's attitude to a certain kind of violence. But anyway, in January 2009, the relationship between union and progress, between fascism and the free market, was sealed with a kiss when Mukesh Ambani and Ratan Tata were given the Gujarat Garima Awards, the Pride of Gujarat Award, and then they said that they would recommend Modi as the Prime Minister. But of course, they have to wait, because then we had our elections in 2009, and the Congress came to power. But let's look at what elections have come to mean in this country. First of all, democracy has come to mean elections, nothing more. That nothing matters except who won the elections. And of course, all these massacres, all these genocides, all of them are election campaigns, because democracy has fused into majoritarianism and is slowly fusing into fascism. But if you look at these 2009 elections, which we are told the UPA won with a thumping majority, actually it won 10% of the vote of the population of this country, 17% of the eligible vote. So this tiny minority is now, we are now told, represents the majority, this sly mathematics of election arithmetic. We know that most of the people who won the election, most of the MPs are millionaires. You know that the elections of this poor country cost more than $2 billion. Some estimates have put it at $10 billion, which is more than the cost of the American elections. Where does that money come from? From the bauxite mountains, from Bela Dila, from the iron ore, from the rivers. That is all our money. But now you can't win an election unless corporates are sponsoring you. So you saw how the biggest advertising for elections were from corporates saying go out and vote, because they know now that India's USP is democracy, which they have completely bought, the best democracy that money can buy. And so, you know, China does sport, so they have the Olympics. We do democracy, so we have elections. But only the rich can win. Only the rich can win. So then we had the whole business of the media selling editorial space, media packages to political parties. Who can buy those packages? Once again, only if you're corporate sponsored. So next time the television channels start shouting at some poor, frightened TV studio guest, why don't the Maoists stand for elections? Just SMS and say because they can't afford your rates. So anyway, then you had the Congress campaigning, of course, campaigning on the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which gives a family 8,000 rupees a year. And people are committing suicide and immolating themselves for that 8,000 rupees a year. But this became the big campaign for the Congress party. But and that NREGA was passed to mitigate the effects of the economic reforms, to mitigate the fact that millions of people were being pushed out of their jobs, were being pushed off their lands. And as soon as the elections were won, the corporate media said, this is a vote for reforms. It's you know, what were the words? It's fast forward for the markets. The vote was for reforms. So elections, of course, can mean anything you want them to mean. So what were these reforms, and what have 20 years of these reforms meant? They meant the privatization of infrastructure, including water supply, electricity, telecommunication, health, housing, education, and transport. It meant the dismantling of laws that protect workers' rights, and international financial institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB actually demand these as conditions. They demand these as conditions before they sanction loans. And the massive infusion of private capital led to a dramatic spurt in the economic growth rate and created a vast middle class, punch-drunk on sudden wealth and the sudden respect that comes with it, and a much, much vaster, desperate underclass. Tens of millions of people have been displaced. As I said, we have the world's largest population of malnutrition children. The food grain intake in some places is lower than sub-Saharan Africa. Recently, there was an international tribunal on this Operation Green Hunt. And here is an answer to the government, and Chidambaram in particular, saying that we can only do development for the tribals after we have secured the area. So first we have to, quote unquote, wipe out the Maoist resistance, then we can do development. This seems to suggest that everywhere else there has been development. There's no malnutrition, the schools are running, the health centers are working, but this is not the case. If you look at the studies that are being done now by the medical community, the biomass index, the BMI of tribal communities, not where the Naxalites are, outside, the biomass index is something like 18.5, which means that it's at the level of chronic hunger bordering on starvation. That kind of hunger actually totally, your autoimmune system stops working and you begin to be vulnerable to every kind of disease, which is why when people die of starvation, they never die of starvation. They die of TB, they die of measles, they die of malaria, because their body can't fight it anymore. Now doctors have started calling that nutritional AIDS. And these people are the people against whom Operation Green Hunt has been announced. These people are the ones against whom helicopter gunships, 200,000 security forces armed with AK-47s and grenades and bombs and ammunition have been sent out. These people. You know, we are a fascist society. There isn't any two ways about it. If we weren't, the streets would be full of us saying, stop this war. How can you do it? How can you do it? In 1950, the Indian Constitution criminalized its tribal population because the laws of the Constitution adopted colonial policy and said that tribal land now belongs to the Indian state. The tribal way of life was criminalized. The forest department became their landlords. So when the forest department was beating them, raping them, dragging them to court, they were only doing their constitutional duty, maybe not the rape, but the rest of it. The rape was just a perk for, a hardship posting. But today, those people who were criminalized then, now what did the Chief Minister of Chhattisgarh say? All those who have not come out of their villages into the camps of the Salwa Judum are Maoists, they are terrorists. So, looking after your chickens, planting your rice, picking your maua is a terrorist act, and you are liable for summary execution. And we call ourselves a democracy. And this is to a population, mind you, that numbers more than the population of almost every country in the world, barring about 10. 85 million tribal people. But in Dantewada, just to look after your chickens is a terrorist act. So, as Gautam did, I too had gone into Dantewada, as many of you know, and questions are often asked to us, but what are you talking about? I mean, surely we need to do mining. We can't stop mining. We need growth. Well, this kind of mining is negative growth. Even right-wing economists like Jeffrey Sachs will tell you that there's an inverse link between growth and countries who have natural resources. This growth of India, this superpower status that we are trying to claim, has left us with a human development index lower than Kyrgyzstan. That's how proud we should be about this spurt of growth. And this kind of mining, privatized mining, corporatized mining, for iron ore, the government earns 27 rupees for every ton of iron ore, while the private company earns 5,000 rupees for iron ore. For bauxite, it's even less. And bauxite, for example, which is being mined in Niyamgiri, which is the center of all the corporate attention now, because we have the 4th largest deposits of bauxite. They say we're just going to take away the bauxite, just the top of the mountain. But if you know anything about the ecology of that place, bauxite on the flat top mountains is a porous rock. It holds water. It's a water tank. Those mountains hold water all year round, and that water comes out through the toes of the mountain in these streams which irrigate the plains. You take away that bauxite, you destroy that entire ecology. To make alumina out of bauxite and aluminium out of alumina is the most toxic process of almost any process. It requires such huge amounts of electricity, such huge amounts of water. So of course you're going to have dams, of course you're going to have power projects, of course you're going to have sort of toxic residue that's dumped which further marginalizes and pushes people off their lands. None of this is of course taken into account. So we are paying with our ecology for other people's economies. As Gautam said, this is what we call growth. The other day I was doing a television interview and the journalist said to me, so you say that democracy is fake, that the constitution has been undermined, that the justice system doesn't work, and so on. So why don't you, I mean, I didn't understand the logic of this, but why don't you go and live somewhere else or something? So I said, you know what, democracy in its institutions has failed us, but the people of this country have stood up in the most fantastic way. For where in the world have we heard of the poorest of the poor standing up, not just the Maoists, but a whole bandwidth, a whole biodiversity of resistance, has kept the most ruthless corporations in their tracks for 5 years. This is a success. We have to stop thinking of ourselves as victims. You know, those of us in the resistance, we must salute the fact that this has been a fantastic effort by people. So many people, you know, say, yell at us, especially at people like me and Gautam, about our stand on the Maoist resistance and what is going on there. So many TV channels are indulging in a kind of orgy of fakery, pretending to be so very concerned about the CRPF men who were killed recently in Dantewada. I want to say something about that. I want to say that every death is a terrible tragedy for us. Whichever side they die on, it is the poor that are dying. And it is a war of the rich against the poor in which the rich put forward the poor to fight the poor. So once again, these deaths we lay at the door of a government. People say, you know, have you visited the families of these CRPF people? You know, we are not politicians that we have to go and pretend to offer fake condolences. But I want to tell you that recently I was in South India, near Pondicherry, and I did go to the homes of some Dalit soldiers who had been killed in Kashmir. As you all know, recently there was a discovery of mass graves in Kashmir. Thousands of people buried in mass graves. Well, those militants at least had graves. The Dalit soldiers were buried on garbage heaps, cremated on garbage heaps. There was separate water in the crematorium for Dalits and upper castes. The Dalit soldiers could not be walked past the upper caste houses to get there. But I don't think you ever see this on the media. I don't think any of you have heard the recording of the SP in Dantewada when the Salva Judum began, Mr. D.S. Manhar. I've heard that recording where he's briefing his men, and he tells them that if you see a journalist coming to cover the Naxalites, shoot him or her. If you see anybody coming to write about this, shoot them. If any village refuses to surrender, burn it. When that became public, the man was transferred to the State Human Rights Commission. So 644 villages have been emptied in Dantewara. 300,000 people are off the government radar. They are in the forest, hiding, not able to go to their villages. And this, I mean, we should not get too sort of personal with the corporate media, because just like the courts have been bought over in so many ways by the corporate project, when you have a media which is structured in which 90% of its turnover comes from corporate advertising, how can it be different? You know, but still some of them do try in whatever ways they can. They do try to make some space, and that we shouldn't forget, that they do try to make some space. But structurally, there is a problem here. I just want to end by reading a little bit. Oh yeah, I wanted to talk to you about the doctor that I met in the forest. What is going on there? I urge you all to read the UN Convention on Genocide, because genocide does not mean taking people into the gas chambers and killing them or shooting them in a firing range. We are far too sophisticated to do that now. And it's very interesting what's happening in India. You know, all these other democracies that we so admire have done their genocides in the past. You know, or they've done their genocides outside while they develop their own human rights kind of mandate within their country. India is in a position where it's having to do its genocide, it's having to eat its own limbs. That's the problem here. So, no, I'm nearly finished. So, let me just read a little bit about the forest here. Yeah, people described what life is like in the forest when a democracy declares war on its poorest people. The police come at night, they told me, 300, 400, sometimes 1,000 of them. They lay a cordon around a village and they lie in wait. At dawn, they catch the first people who go out to the fields and use them as human shields to enter the village and show them where the booby traps are. Once the police enter the village, they loot and steal and burn houses. The SPOs come along with the police because they are the ones who know where the money and the jewelry is hidden. They catch people and take them away and extract money before they release them. They always carry some extra Maoist uniforms. They get money for killing Maoists, so sometimes they manufacture them. Most people are too frightened to stay at home. They live in the forest at night and come home only in the day. They have an elaborate system of patrols and sentries to alert them about any strangers approaching. The people I met told me how so many old people, ill people, deaf, dumb, blind, and disabled people had been the first to be killed because they weren't quick enough to escape. They told me how people had built tunnels under their homes to hide the children when the police came, and about a blind man who hides himself in a hollowed out log of wood because he cannot run away. And while we are talking about violence, how can we not mention a state that has institutionalized the business of encounter killing? You get bravery awards if you kill people. They criticize the Maoists' people's courts. But, I mean, those are terrible, but at least there are people there. Here, a single encounter specialist can just end people's lives and get a medal on his chest on Republic Day and get a promotion. So where have these double standards come from? In the forest, I met Chamri, mother of Dilip, a member of a village militia who was shot in July 2009. She said that after they killed him, the police tied her son's body to a pole like an animal and carried it with them because they need to produce the bodies to get their cash rewards, otherwise someone else will muscle in on the kill. Chamri ran behind them all the way to the police station. By the time they reached, the body didn't have a scrap of clothing on it. On the way, Chamri said, they left the body by the roadside while they stopped at a dhaba to have tea and biscuits, which they did not pay for. Picture this mother for a moment, following her son's corpse through the forest, stopping at a distance to wait for his murderers to finish their tea. They did not let her have her son's body back so that she could give him a proper funeral. They only let her throw a fistful of earth in the pit where they had buried the others they had killed that day. When I met her, she said she wants badla ku badla, which is blood for blood. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. In this tranquil-looking forest, life seemed completely militarized. Gondi-speaking people know English words like cordon and search, firing, advance, retreat. To harvest their crops, they need the guerrilla army to do a sentry patrol. Going to the market is a military operation. The markets are full of informers who the police have lured from their villages with 1,500 rupees a month. I am told there's a Mukhbir Muhalla, an informers colony in a nearby town called Narayanpur, where at least 400 Mukhbirs stay. The men can't go to the market anymore. The women go, but they're watched closely. If they buy even a little extra, the police accuse them of buying it for the Maoists. Chemists have instructions not to let people buy medicines except in very small quantities. Low-price rations from the public distribution system, sugar, rice, kerosene, are warehoused in police stations, making it impossible for people to buy. There are almost no doctors and only a couple of small clinics in an area that covers 60,000 kilometers, contains thousands of villages and millions of people. The one doctor who I met, who had only arrived recently, gave me a medical profile of the area, which made my blood run cold. Most of the people he has seen, he said, have a hemoglobin count between 5 and 6. The average standard for Indian women is 11. There's tuberculosis caused by more than 2 years of chronic anemia. Apart from this, there's malaria, osteoporosis, tapeworm, severe ear and tooth infections, and primary amenorrhea, which is malnutrition during puberty, when it causes a woman's menstrual cycle to disappear or never appear in the first place. Young children suffer from protein energy malnutrition grade 2, in medical terminology called kwashiorkor. It's an epidemic here, like in Biafra, he said. I've worked in villages before, but I've never seen anything like this. Desperately poor people living in conditions of near famine, barely able to survive in times of peace, have now been placed under siege and are now being made war upon. So who are the stakeholders of this kind of progress? They're not always easy to identify. Between the CEOs in their private jets and the wretched mukhbirs and special police officers being paid a pittance to turn on their own people, there's a universe of primary, secondary, and tertiary stakeholders. These people don't have to declare their interests, but they're allowed to use their positions and good offices to further them. How will we ever know which political party, which ministers, which MPs, which politicians, which judges, which NGOs, which expert consultants, and which police officers have a direct or indirect stake in the booty? How will we ever know which newspaper reporting the latest Maoist quote-unquote atrocity, which TV channel reporting directly from ground zero are stakeholders? Many newspapers in Chhattisgarh have direct mining interests. So what are they going to report? What is the provenance of the billions of dollars secretly stashed away by Indian citizens in Swiss bank accounts? Where did the $2 billion spent on the last general election come from? Where do the hundreds of millions of rupees that political parties and politicians pay the media for favorable election coverage come from? What are we to make of the fact that our Home Minister P. Chidambaram, the CEO of Operation Green Hunt, has in his career as a corporate lawyer represented the interests of several mining corporations? What are we to make of the fact that when he became finance minister, one of the first clearances he gave for foreign direct investment was to a Mauritius-based company to buy shares in Sterlite, a subsidiary of Vedanta? What are we to make of the fact that in the Supreme Court, which was hearing the case of the human rights violations committed by Vedanta, the judge said, okay, let's not give it to Vedanta, let's give it to Sterlite. I have shares in Sterlite. And Sterlite is a sister company of Vedanta. What are you supposed to do with that? What are we to make of the fact that on October 2009, at the mandatory public hearing for Tata's integrated steel plant, meant to be held in Lohandigura, where local people could come, actually took place in a small hall inside the collectorate in Jagdalpur, many miles away, cordoned off with massive security. A hired audience of 50 tribals was brought in a guarded convoy of government jeeps. After the meeting, the district collector congratulated the people of Lohandigura for their cooperation. The local newspapers reported the lie, even though they knew better. The advertising rolled in. Despite villagers' objections, land acquisition for the project has begun. And on the walls of the houses in Lohandigura, it says, Naxali aao, hame bachao. So there's a resistance there now too. India's miraculous growth story has come at a huge social and environmental cost. And now as the rivers dry up and the forests disappear, as the water table recedes, people are beginning to realize what's being done to them. And all over the country there's unrest. And suddenly it begins to look as though the aspiration for a 10% growth rate and any kind of genuine democracy are mutually exclusive. Now, just on the question of the use of arms and violent resistance, I want to say one thing, that in a forest village, outside the forest, nonviolent resistance hasn't always worked. We all know the history of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, but Gandhian resistance needs an audience. It's fine political theater, and it needs an audience. But inside the forest, there is no audience. These are people who've been marginalized for decades, for centuries. How can those who are starving go on a hunger strike? How can those who have no money not pay their taxes or boycott goods? How can they do it? When your village is surrounded by 1,000 policemen who are burning and raping and shooting to kill, what are people supposed to do? All the time these mandarins tell you there is no alternative to this new economic policy. Can they tell the people of Dantewada what alternative they should have for their resistance policy? Is there an alternative they can suggest? Should they go to the court? Should they sing songs? Should they do dharna? What should they do? Of all the secessionist struggles in India, the most successful has been the secession of the middle and upper classes into a country of their own somewhere in the sky. From there they look down, the sky citizens, and they see Adivasis sitting on the bauxite mountains of Orissa, on the iron ore in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. They see the people of Nandigram sitting on prime land which really ought to be a chemical hub. They see thousands of acres of farmland, and they think these really ought to be special economic zones for our industries. They see the rich fields of Singur and know this really ought to be a car factory for the Tata Nano, the people's car. They think that's our bauxite, our iron ore, our uranium. What are these people doing on our land? What's our water doing in their rivers? What's our timber doing in their trees? It's absurd to imagine that Operation Green Hunt is only meant to flush out Maoists from the forest. It's a war against the poor, against the non-consuming class, who the Germans used to call Überzahligen Essern, the superfluous eaters. But unfortunately for the sky citizens, in India at least, they're not going to get a walkover. The superfluous people are fighting back. Across the Asian subcontinent, from Afghanistan through Waziristan, the northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan, through the northeastern states of India, and across the Red Corridor, it is the tribal areas that have risen up in revolt. The nature of the uprising has taken the form of radical Islam in Afghanistan and Pakistan, struggles for self-determination in Manipur and Nagaland, and has shaded into radical communism in the forested heartland of India. But the assault on these homelands is driven by the same thing, by free market capitalism and its endless quest to capture and control what it sees as resources. Now, when we think of this planet rushing towards a kind of ecological destruction, environmental destruction, we need to change the way our brain works. It would be too much to expect that an alternative to what looks like a planet rushing towards catastrophe will come from the imagination that has brought us to this pass in the first place. But the first step towards reimagining a world gone terribly wrong would be to stop making war on those who have a different imagination, an imagination outside of capitalism and, for that matter, communism, an imagination which has an altogether different understanding of what constitutes happiness and fulfillment. To gain this philosophical space, it will be necessary to concede some physical space for the survival of those who may appear to be relics from our past, but who may actually be the keepers of the secrets to our collective future. To concede that space, we have to ask, can we leave the bauxite in the mountain? Can we leave the water in the rivers and the trees in the forest? If we cannot, then it will not help to preach morality to the victims of this war. Thank you. Extractive short-term gain provide this? Could it be that democracy, the sacred answer to our short-term hopes and prayers, the protector of our individual freedoms and nurturer of our avaricious dreams, will turn out to be the end game for the human race? Could it be that democracy is such a hit with modern humans precisely because it mirrors our greatest folly, our nearsightedness, our inability to live entirely in the present like most animals do, combined with our inability to see very far into the future, makes us strange in-between creatures, neither beast nor prophet. Our amazing intelligence seems to have outstripped our instinct for survival. We plunder the earth, hoping that accumulating material surplus will make up for the profound, unfathomable thing that we have lost. There was a time not so long ago, even up to the 70s, when democracy in former colonies actually threatened imperial power. So you saw that the Soviet Union, of course, had done away with it. So what I think I'll try and do is to zoom out a little bit, to try and look at this problem in a structural way. What exactly is the situation that we are in now? Because the way the whole debate is being presented to the public, you saw the interview with Chidambaram on the cover of Tehelka. He says, stop the violence for 72 hours and I will sort out the war, which suggests that someone else is doing the violence and he's asking for peace. And the whole of Operation Green Hunt is presented to us as though, but the United States was toppling democracy after democracy all over Latin America, in Iran, and so on. So why is it that democracy, which was at one time a threat to imperialism, today wars are being waged in order to put in democracies? Why is it that democracy has stopped being a threat? Because capitalism and the free market has learned how to operate democracies. It's learned how to hollow out every single one of those institutions and make it work for itself. So when I was in school once long ago, I raided the vegetable garden of my Malayalam school teacher, and I stole all the carrots and I planted the tops back. And I watched him for days watering those plants and wondering why they were dying. And I think this is what has happened to our democracy. Each of these institutions, the court, the media, the parliament, the elections, all of these, the government is trying to bring peace to the tribal areas. It has to make war in order to bring peace, in order to end the violence. But actually, the truth is that these corporate companies and this corporate-backed government desperately needs this war. It needs this war in order to get people off their lands, and that's why this war is being fought. Let's not even for 1 minute try and fool ourselves to think that the government is trying to make peace. The policy is a policy of war. So I'm going to just read from something that I've written, which first puts this in a perspective, and then I'll speak and then I'll read a little bit more. It's from a lecture that I recently did, and it's called, Can We Leave the Bauxite in the Mountain? It's part of many things I've been writing over the years. But while we're still arguing about whether there's life after death, can we add another question to the cart? Is there life after democracy? And what sort of life will it be? By democracy, I don't mean democracy as an ideal or an aspiration. I mean the working model, Western liberal democracy and its variants, such as they are. So, is there life after democracy? Because the real question is, what have we done to democracy? What have we turned it into? What happens once democracy has been used up? When it has been hollowed out and emptied of meaning? What happens when each of its institutions has turned into something dangerous? What happens now that democracy and the free market have fused into a single predatory organism with a thin, constricted imagination that revolves almost entirely around the idea of maximizing profit? Is it possible to reverse this process? Can something that has mutated go back to being what it used to be? What we need today for the sake of the survival of this planet is long-term vision. Can governments whose very survival depends on immediate